year, I made a 3D game for this handheld, which is barely more powerful than a Game Boy Advance, and only has a black and white screen. But why? To explain that, we need to go all the way back to the tail end of the 1970s, back to the dimly lit arcade rooms of the time, back to Space Invaders. It may look primitive now, but buried in that simplicity is one of the most genius breakthroughs in game development history. You see, as you kill the aliens, they speed up, putting pressure on the player to react more quickly, and it feels intentional, like the game is responding to your input. But it wasn't. At least it wasn't designed that way. And that's because the game was designed on the Intel 8080 processor. It just simply couldn't handle animating all of those sprites at once. So what happened? Well, as the player was killing the aliens, the CPU had less sprites to render and thus ran faster. It would kind of be like designing a game nowadays without delta time in mind, so that when you designed it at 60 FPS, sure, ran just fine, but the moment the player went to 120 FPS, everything was like twice as fast, and 30 FPS, everything was twice as slow. Tomohiro Nishikado, the game's designer, noticed this when testing the game, and he liked how it felt. Yeah, it wasn't planned, but it was more fun, so Nishikado said no to fixing the bug and left it in, thus creating the very first difficulty curve in gaming history, and also marking one of the clearest examples of creativity through limitation that I can think of. And so that brings me back to Wing Squadron, the game I made last year. I had picked up the Playdate, which is this cute little yellow box that you see here. It has a crank as an input device. It's adorable. I love it. I think I drove my friends mad when I first picked this up because I was so enamored by its design and simplicity. It captivated me, and I loved it so much that I just knew I had to make a game for it. And the Playdate is packed with limitations. It only has a 1-bit screen. That means the pixels can either be on or off, no grayscale, none at all. It is also only barely more powerful than a Game Boy Advance. On paper, it's way more faster than that, but in reality, about a Game Boy Advance, in certain situations, even like a Game Boy Color, it's not the fastest thing out there. But rather than seeing those as obstacles, I saw them as an opportunity to try to push the limits of the device. Oh, wait. Why are these? Why am I'm not recording the opening again, but why were those on? Anyhow, I was thinking about the Space Invaders story and wondering if I, limited similarly to Nishikado, could have a similar epiphany that he did. Some sort of a breakthrough that would change my understanding of game design in one way or another. Doesn't have to be as revolutionary as the difficulty curve in the creation of that, but just something that would expand my capabilities as a developer. I had to find out. Now, the Playdate only officially supports Lua and C, and between the two, I went with Lua. Not because it's faster, quite the opposite actually. Lua runs about 5 to 20 times slower than C, depending on what you're doing. But it's because it's so limited compared to C that I just felt like I wanted to push the capabilities of what Lua could do on the device. It sounded fun. It's also worth mentioning that the Playdate does offer something called Pulp, which is an all-in-one game maker, kind of like GB Studio and Pico 8, but I wanted a bit more control with what I had in mind. So that takes me to Wing Squadron. I made it for a 2-week game jam. I had this idea to do Starfox, but mixed with the progression system of Vampire Survivors. And come to think of it, it's kind of a theme with my games, isn't it? Just mixing in Vampire Survivors in some capacity or another. Whatever, I did it anyways. And the idea was simple. Start with a short intro segment that teaches the controls of the story, and then hand the player the keys to an endless mode for replayability. That said, I had no idea what I signed myself up for. You see, the Playdate does support 3D, but only for C, and it even ships with a few demo projects to prove it. But because I wanted to try pushing Lua to its limits, and I'm admittedly a little stubborn, I stuck with Lua. So I spent the first week of the entire jam wrestling with the device, trying to get any kind of 3D rendering to work in Lua, and I'm proud to say I actually managed to pull it off. To the best of my knowledge, Wing Squadron is the very first and probably only 3D Lua game published to date, and even more shockingly, nobody has complained about the performance on it at all. It runs at about 20 FPS in the original Playdate and 25 FPS on the second revision, which is what I used. Now, how did I do this? Well, first, because the camera never moves, I could predetermine which polygons were facing the camera and only render those. Secondly, I ran some benchmarks to determine what the upper limit of faces I could show were, and that number worked out to being 144 unshaded faces and 72 shaded faces. And because I wanted shading so that you can tell what you're looking at on such a simple screen, I had to limit it to 72. And the way I did that is I looked at what was closest to the camera and what was rendering further out, and I only showed the first 72 faces closest to the camera. And finally, I leaned heavily on a forum post that dissected the most performant drawing techniques in Lua, using the fastest methods available and avoiding anything unnecessarily expensive. Since 3D in Lua is a virtually unexplored territory, at least as it comes to the Playdate, it was a lot of experimentation on my part to figure it out, but in the end, I gained a greater appreciation for how 3D engines work. And it gave me a big appreciation for engines like Godot and Unity for simplifying it for the end developer. I mean, on modern engines, it's such a thing we take for granted. Backface calling an LOD is simply a toggle, but for me, I had to actually program it in to have that functionality for my game. So I ended up feeling the cost of every line of code that I was writing and how impactful it was to the end result. And honestly, I feel I wouldn't have walked away with this level of appreciation if I hadn't have set out to limit myself in the first place. By the way, a quick aside, if you're liking this video so far, please consider hitting the subscribe button if you aren't already, and as well as hitting the like button and perhaps commenting below. It really means a lot to me, and it's helping to motivate me to get more videos out quickly. All right, now, shockingly to me, Wing Squadron actually became kind of like a cult hit in the Playdate community. Best I can tell, it's installed on about 1% of every Playdate out there. I can't find the actual numbers for the amount of Playdates sold, but my estimate is probably a little under 100,000 units, and it has about 1,000 downloads on itch.io, so about 1%. And whenever somebody asks for a really good shoot 'em up or vampire survivors like game for the Playdate, inevitably Wing Squadron gets recommended in Reddit and on the Discord, and that feels awesome. But where am I going with all this? Well, I genuinely think that every developer, big or small, should try working within limitations at least once. Not just as an artistic challenge, but as a way to personally grow. For me, it gave me a deeper understanding and appreciation for how 3D engines work. For Tomohiro Nishikado, it created one of the most enduring game design principles ever. And there are countless other games where we can see that this technique has worked successfully. Silent Hill, for example, had to use this really thick fog in order to mask the limited draw distance of the PS1, and in essence created what we think of today as that PS1 style horror that is pervasive on itch.io. And Notch couldn't figure out how to render complex, procedurally generated 3D worlds, so he simplified everything into this chunky voxel aesthetic that ended up resulting in Minecraft. These breakthroughs are born through constraint and limitation, and if you start looking, you'll see it everywhere in retro games. Now, how can you try this out for yourself? Well, for one, you could do it on the Playdate. Even if you don't have one, the SDK comes with a very nice emulator for testing out games. It doesn't perfectly replicate the hardware of the Playdate, but it does let you develop full games for the Playdate, and you can even publish them if you enjoy them. You just need to temper your expectations for the performance a little bit and maybe find someone in the community that can test it for you on actual hardware. Because trust me, it is really, really, really limited, way more so than what you're expecting. Alternatively, engines like GB Studio and Pico 8 are designed to emulate older hardware, enforcing creative limitation by design. They're self-contained, beginner-friendly, and restrict you just enough to think differently about how you approach game design. And if you do make something that you're really passionate about on those engines, there are totally ways to publish those on Steam, on itch, and other platforms so that you can have a bit of a return on your investment. And I believe in this idea so much that I'm actually planning out my first game jam that's all about game limitation. I'm planning for it to happen when this channel hits 1,000 subscribers, which at the current pace might happen before the end of the month. And the problem there is that I'm going to be at Gen Con, which is this really awesome convention for board games. So more realistically, expect the Game Jam to launch somewhere on the latter half of August or early September. Once it's live on itch and I've locked in the dates, I'll post an update on the community tab to let all of my subscribers know. I'll also make an announcement on Discord. Speaking of which, I've got a Discord that you can join right now. I wasn't expecting my last video to blow up quite like it did, and I wasn't prepared for everyone that wanted to join a Discord, and I got a lot of messages about it, so I've set one up. But as always, there's a twist. I don't want it to just be a community for this channel. That's kind of boring. I don't like joining those kind of Discords. I'm assuming most people don't like joining those kind of Discords either. So I want it to be a real community, a place to share ideas, get help on problems that you're having, find teammates, or just chat with other like-minded developers. It was amazing seeing how my last video resonated with everyone in the comments, and I would love to carry over that nuanced discussion to the Discord server. Links in the description if you're interested. I'd love to see you there. And with that, thank you for watching, and let's keep making awesome games.